Billionaire dad protects a homeless woman from being humiliated at a restaurant, and his later actions move everyone. The crystal of the wine glasses reflected the golden light from the chandeliers as Richard Turner pushed open the heavy oak door of Le Bernardin. His right hand held firmly onto the small fingers of Emily, his 5-year-old daughter, whose blonde curls bounced with each excited step. "Daddy, this place is huge," Emily whispered, her light blue eyes wide before the imposing dining room. Richard smiled. At 42, he had built a hotel empire that allowed him to frequent the city's best restaurants. But nothing compared to the pleasure of seeing the world through his daughter's curious eyes. "Good evening, Mr. Turner." The maitre d' approached with reverence. "Your usual table?" "Perfect, James." As they were led through the dining room, Richard noticed the respectful glances from other patrons. Some recognized him from business magazines. Others simply sensed his commanding presence. Emily walked beside him, observing everything with the natural ease typical of children. The reserved table was near the large window overlooking the bustling avenue. Emily climbed onto the cushioned chair, having to stretch to reach the polished mahogany table. "What are we eating today, Daddy?" Richard picked up the leather-bound menu. "How about grilled salmon for you, and maybe some golden potatoes? Can I have orange juice?" "Of course, Princess." The waiter approached, dressed in an impeccable uniform. Richard placed the order while Emily played with the linen napkin, folding it into imaginary shapes. "Daddy, look." It turned into a little bird. Very creative. Richard felt his chest warm. These moments together were his refuge after intense days managing hotels, endless meetings, and decisions that affected hundreds of employees. The dinner arrived on white porcelain plates. Emily attacked the potatoes with enthusiasm, talking about her day at the private school she attended. "Teacher Sarah said I'm going to learn to read big books soon." "That's great. Soon you'll be reading to me." It was then that the elegant atmosphere of the restaurant was broken by a noise at the entrance. Raised voices, hurried footsteps. Richard looked over his shoulder and saw James, the maitre d', gesturing nervously near the door. A thin woman, with dirty blonde hair and torn clothes, was pushing the glass door open. Her light blue eyes, though tired, held a dignity that contrasted with her worn-out appearance. "Please," her voice echoed through the silent room. "I'm hungry." The desperate cry cut through the elegant conversations like a blade. Silverware stopped mid-air, and whispers began between the tables. An elderly lady with lavish jewelry muttered something about the kind of people who show up in these places. The manager, a middle-aged man with a meticulously trimmed mustache, approached with firm steps and a stern expression. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately. You are disturbing our customers." The woman came closer, her hands trembling. "I just need a little food, anything. I haven't eaten in days." James, the maitre d', tried to discreetly guide her back to the entrance, but she resisted. "Please, just a piece of bread, anything." Emily stopped eating completely, her light blue eyes fixed on the woman. She studied the thin face, the torn clothes, the expression of despair. "Daddy," she tugged on his suit sleeve, her little voice filled with genuine concern. Richard followed his daughter's gaze, watching the scene unfold. The manager was already signaling for 2 security guards to approach, while other customers murmured in discontent. The woman took a step back when she saw the security guards, but her gaze remained pleading. "I'm hungry," she repeated, louder this time, her voice echoing through the room in a desperate plea. Emily stood up on her chair, her clear and determined voice cutting through the tense air. "Daddy, can we help her?" The child's simple and direct question plunged the entire restaurant into absolute silence. All eyes turned to the Turner's cacao table. The manager immediately recognized who was seated there, and his posture changed. "Mr. Turner, I apologize for the disturbance. We'll handle this immediately." But Richard had already made his decision. He stood up slowly, looking directly at the woman who was still trembling near the entrance. His voice came out firm and clear, echoing throughout the room. "Dine with us." The 2 simple words had a seismic impact on the elegant environment. The silence became even more profound, if that were possible. Waiters stopped with trays in the air, customers turned completely in their chairs, and even the discreet clinking of crystal ceased. The woman covered her face with her hands, and her shoulders began to shake violently. She couldn't speak for a few seconds, just shook her head in disbelief. Emily clapped her hands. "Oh, we're beaming. Yes, Daddy. She can sit here with us." The maitre d' looked from Richard to the woman, clearly conflicted between the establishment's strict rules and his respect for one of his most important clients. After a few seconds of hesitation, he made a discreet gesture for a chair to be brought over. The woman approached slowly, as if walking in a dream. Her legs seemed barely able to support her. I can't believe it," she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. "Are you really—" "Please, sit," Richard said gently, indicating the chair the waiter had positioned. "What's your name?" "Grace." She sat down carefully, as if the chair might disappear at any moment. "Grace Williams." "I'm Richard, and this is Emily." Emily waved cheerfully, her light blue eyes shining with satisfaction. "Hi, Grace." "You have pretty hair, even if it's dirty." Grace looked at the child, and for the first time a genuine smile appeared on her tired lips. "Hello, Emily. You're very kind." The waiter approached, visibly uncomfortable, but maintaining his professionalism. "What would the lady like to order?" Grace took the menu with trembling hands, clearly intimidated by the exorbitant prices. Maybe just a soup? The cheapest one?" "Not at all," Richard intervened firmly. "Bring her the grilled salmon, just like Emily's, and an appetizer as well." "The best you have." "Yes, sir." While they waited, Emily started a lively conversation with Grace, asking where she lived and if she liked stories. Richard watched the interaction, impressed by his daughter's natural ability to accept the new company. "Do you live in a house, Grace?" Emily asked innocently. Grace hesitated, looking at Richard as if asking for permission to be honest. "Not exactly, sweetie. I live on the street." "On the street?" Emily frowned, confused. "But where do you sleep when it rains?" "Sometimes I find a dry place, sometimes I don't." The simple, direct answer made Richard feel a pang in his chest. Emily processed the information with the typical logic of a child. "That must be very cold and uncomfortable." "It is," Grace admitted. When the food arrived, Grace held the fork with visibly shaking hands. Her eyes filled with tears as she cut the first piece of salmon. "It's been so long," she whispered to herself. "How long since your last meal?" Richard asked gently. "For 3 days, maybe 4. Grace chewed slowly, savoring every bite. "I had forgotten what real food tastes like." Emily immediately pushed her plate toward Grace. "You can eat my potatoes too. Mommy always said that sharing is caring." Richard felt his heart ache. Emily rarely mentioned her mother, who had died in an accident when she was just 2 years old. Grace accepted a few potatoes, visibly moved. "Your daughter has a huge heart," she said to Richard, her voice thick with emotion. She definitely got that from her mother. As Grace ate, she began to relax and share fragments of her story. Her voice was low, but there was an evident education in her words, an articulation that contrasted with her current appearance. "I had a normal life until a few years ago. I worked in an office as an administrative assistant. I had a small apartment, but it was mine. I paid my bills on time, had plans for the future." "What changed?" Richard asked. Grace paused, cutting a smaller piece of salmon. "My mother got sick, terminal cancer. I used all my savings on experimental treatments. Then I had to sell everything I owned. When she died, I was completely broke and had been unemployed for months from taking care of her." Emily stopped eating and reached out her small hand to touch Grace's arm. "I'm sorry about your mommy." "Thank you, little one." Grace stroked Emily's blonde hair. "After that, it was one thing after another. Without a fixed address, no one would give me a job. Without a job, I couldn't pay rent. It's a cycle that seems impossible to break." Richard nodded gravely. He knew well the cruel logic of that downward spiral. "How long have you been living on the street?" 8 months. The answer hit Richard like a punch. He looked at Grace with new eyes, seeing beyond her deteriorated appearance. It was easy to imagine how she had been, a hard-working, independent woman who simply had the misfortune of facing a series of devastating tragedies. Throughout the meal, Richard observed not only Grace and Emily, but also the reactions of the people around them. Some customers whispered among themselves, others pretended not to see, but a few watched with something that looked like silent admiration. What impressed him most was Emily's complete naturalness. To her, there was nothing extraordinary about sharing a meal with someone in need. It was simply what good people did. Emily insisted on sharing her dessert, an elaborate chocolate pudding, with Grace, who accepted with tears running down her face. "You're a gift from heaven, Emily," she said. "I like you, Grace. You're nice to talk to." When they finished, Grace stood up slowly, as if she didn't want the magical moment to end. "I have no words to express my gratitude. You gave me much more than a meal today. You gave me back a piece of my humanity." Richard discreetly took out a few bills from his wallet. "So you can take proper care of yourself for the next few days." Grace initially tried to refuse, but Richard insisted, "It's not charity. It's just one person acknowledging another." Before leaving, Grace knelt beside Emily's chair. "Thank you, Princess. You taught me today that there are still angels in the world." Emily hugged her tightly. "Are you going to be okay, Grace?" Grace looked into the child's light blue eyes, then at Richard. "I'll try. Thank you both." As Grace left, walking more upright than when she had arrived, the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Richard paid the bill while Emily played thoughtfully with her napkin. "Daddy," she said as they walked to the car, "why were those people looking at us funny?" Richard chose his words carefully. Sometimes people get uncomfortable when they see situations that make them think about difficult things, but Grace was hungry. All we had to do was give her food. "You're right, Princess, that's exactly right." Emily nodded, satisfied with the simplicity of the logic. Driving home, Richard reflected on the extraordinary evening. In his 42 years, he had faced countless complex business decisions, negotiations worth millions, moments that defined his career. But something about that night felt different, more significant. Perhaps it was the memory of his own humble childhood before financial success arrived. Perhaps it was the absolute purity of the compassion shown by Emily. Or perhaps it was the recognition that, in a world where it's easy to become indifferent to the suffering of others, his 5-year-old daughter still saw every person as deserving of basic dignity. That night, Richard Turner had done more than pay for an expensive dinner for a stranger. He had given Grace Williams something infinitely more valuable, the reminder that genuinely good people still existed in the world and that she deserved to be among them. The echo of his daughter's simple words kept resonating in his mind. "Daddy, can we help her?" And his own equally simple response, "Dine with us." 2 sentences that had changed at least 3 lives that night in ways he was only beginning to understand. The BMW's engine purred softly as Richard drove through the city's illuminated streets. The streetlights cast golden patterns inside the car, and Emily was quiet in the back seat, looking out the window. For the first few minutes of the drive, she remained silent, which was unusual for a 5-year-old who normally chattered about everything she saw. Richard watched her in the rearview mirror, noticing how thoughtful she seemed. "Fardzid?" Emily finally broke the silence, her small voice echoing in the quiet interior of the car. "Yes, Princess." "Is Grace going to sleep on the street tonight?" Richard felt a pang in his chest. He had hoped Emily would simply forget the encounter after dinner, as children often do. But his daughter was still processing what she had witnessed. "Probably so," he answered honestly. He never lied to Emily about important things. Emily was quiet for a few blocks, watching the beautiful, well-lit houses pass by the window. Each one represented safety, warmth, a family protected from the outside world. "It must be very cold," she murmured. "Yes, it must be." The traffic light turned red, and Richard stopped the car. Emily unbuckled her seatbelt and moved to the middle of the seat, leaning forward until she could rest her arm on her father's shoulder. "Daddy." Her voice was soft, but filled with a concern that seemed too big for such a small child. "Couldn't you help more?" "She can't stay alone on the street." The words hit Richard with unexpected force. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw his daughter's light blue eyes reflected there, serious and hopeful. The light turned green, but Richard took a few seconds to accelerate. Emily's simple question echoed in his mind, filled with an innocence that cut through all the complications an adult mind could create. Richard began, but couldn't finish the sentence. What could he say? That helping Grace beyond that night would be complicated. That he had responsibilities, a company to run, a reputation to maintain. Emily remained leaning on his shoulder, waiting for an answer that didn't come. She seemed really sad before she ate with us, Emily continued, but when she smiled at me, she looked different, like she was herself again. Richard drove the rest of the way in silence, with Emily still resting on his shoulder. His daughter's physical presence was comforting, but her words continued to resonate in his mind. When they arrived at their mansion in the suburbs, Richard helped Emily out of the car. The house stood majestically before them, with its lit windows and perfectly manicured gardens. The contrast with what Grace would face that night was stark. "Daddy," Emily said as they climbed the marble steps to the entrance, "do you think Grace has a family? She mentioned siblings. Why don't they help her?" Richard paused with the key in the lock. It was a complex question to explain to a 5-year-old. Sometimes families lose track of each other, Princess. Sometimes people are ashamed to ask for help. Emily considered this while Richard opened the door. "I would never be ashamed to ask for your help, Daddy. And I hope you never have to," Richard replied, feeling that ache in his chest again. After her bath and nightly rituals, Richard tucked Emily into bed. She held his arm as he stood up to leave. "Daddy, do you promise you'll think about Grace?" Richard looked at his daughter's angelic face, framed by her blonde hair spread across the pillow. "I promise." Emily smiled and let him go. "Good night, Daddy. I love you." "I love you too, Princess." Richard closed the bedroom door and went down to his study. The house was quiet, with only the ticking of the antique clock in the hallway echoing off the walls. He sat in his leather armchair and poured himself a glass of whiskey. Normally, this was his time to review contracts, plan expansions for his hotel chain, or answer important emails. But that night, his mind was completely occupied with other things. Emily's words echoed constantly. "Couldn't you help more?" Richard grew up in an upper-middle-class family. His father was a successful corporate lawyer, his mother a respected socialite who organized charity events. He had never known real hardship, never questioned where his next meal would come from. As a child, he occasionally saw people experiencing homelessness, but they were distant, almost abstract figures. His parents would avoid them with a discreet change of path, and if Richard ever asked about them, he received vague answers about people who made bad choices. It was only in college, studying business at Harvard, that he began to understand the socio-economic complexities behind poverty. But even then, it remained a theoretical issue, something to be discussed in seminars or cited in academic papers. His fortune came through hard work, smart decisions, and, he admitted to himself, a good dose of luck in being in the right place at the right time when the hotel market boomed. But he had never faced real adversity, never been truly vulnerable. Until that night, encounters with homeless people were quick transactions. A dollar bill passed through a car window, an annual donation to charitable organizations, always maintaining a safe and comfortable distance. But Grace was different. For some reason, she had become real to him in a way he had never experienced before. Perhaps it was because Emily had completely humanized her, treating her not as a social problem, but as a person who deserved care. Richard took a sip of his whiskey and looked out his study window. Outside, the garden was well lit by security lights, every bush and flower perfectly placed. It was a controlled, predictable, safe world. Somewhere in the city, Grace was looking for a place to spend the night. Maybe at the shelter she had mentioned, if there was space. Maybe on a park bench or under an awning, if there wasn't. The thought bothered him in a way he couldn't fully explain. Richard had always considered himself a good person. He paid his taxes, donated to charities, treated his employees fairly. But he had never gotten personally involved, never put a specific face to the idea of helping the needy. Now he had a face and a story, and, thanks to Emily, a sense of personal responsibility he couldn't ignore. He thought of Grace's expression when she finally allowed herself to relax during dinner, how her eyes lit up when Emily shared her potatoes, how she had straightened her posture upon leaving the restaurant, as if she had reclaimed some of her lost dignity. Couldn't you help more? Emily's question wasn't just about Grace, Richard realized. It was about the kind of person he wanted to be, the kind of example he wanted to set for his daughter. Emily had grown up with all the privileges money could buy: private school, expensive toys, vacations at luxury resorts. But somehow, she had developed an instinctive compassion that Richard wasn't sure where it came from. Perhaps it was because she had lost her mother so young. Perhaps that had made her more sensitive to the suffering of others. Or perhaps it was simply her nature, a pure kindness that hadn't yet been corrupted by the cynicism of the adult world. Richard finished his whiskey and went up to his room, but sleep didn't come easily. He lay in his king-size bed, staring at the ceiling, as his mind processed the night's events. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Grace trembling at the restaurant entrance. He heard her desperate voice, "I'm hungry." And then he heard Emily, "Daddy, can we help her?" His own response had come out instinctively, "Dine with us." But now, in the quiet of his room, Richard wondered if that had really been his voice, or if it had been something deeper, something Emily had awakened in him. The hours passed slowly. Richard looked at the digital clock. 2:47 a.m. Somewhere in the city, Grace was trying to sleep in conditions he couldn't even imagine. He thought of his hotel chain, 23 properties spread across 5 states, thousands of employees, annual revenue in the millions. Surely there was something he could do, but it was more complicated than that. It wasn't just about giving money or offering a temporary job. Grace needed a real chance to rebuild her life, and that required more than a quick fix. Richard finally fell asleep as the first rays of sunlight began to appear at the window. His last conscious thoughts were of Emily, of the purity of her compassion, and of how she had managed to see something that night that he, with all his experience and education, had almost missed. The possibility that a 5-year-old understood something fundamental about humanity that he at 42 was just beginning to grasp. When he woke up a few hours later, Richard knew his life had changed the night before. The question was no longer whether he should help Grace. The question was how. Richard arrived at his office the next morning with a determination he hadn't felt in years. He had barely had his coffee when he called Marcus, his personal assistant, for an urgent meeting. "Marcus, I need you to do something for me," Richard said, closing his office door. "Last night, I had dinner with a woman named Grace Williams. She's homeless, likely slept in a shelter downtown." Marcus took out a notepad, used to unusual requests from his boss, but this was different. "I want you to use all our contacts to locate her. Check the main shelters, social assistance organizations, anywhere she might have sought help." "Understood, sir. May I ask the reason?" Richard hesitated for a moment. How could he explain that his 5-year-old daughter had planted a seed of conscience that he could no longer ignore? "It's personal, Marcus. Just help me find her. I'll get on it right away." The next few hours passed slowly for Richard. He tried to focus on hotel occupancy spreadsheets, on expansion proposals for the European market, but his mind kept going back to Grace. Where was she? Had she found a safe place to sleep? Had she eaten anything? Around 2 in the afternoon, Marcus knocked on the door. "Mr. Turner, I've found Grace Williams. She's at the St. Vincent Assistance Center on Oak Street. It's a shelter that offers meals and temporary housing." Richard stood up immediately. "Great work, Marcus. Cancel my 3 o'clock meeting. And call Emily's school. Tell them I'm picking her up early today." 40 minutes later, Richard was parking in front of a simple red brick building. A faded sign read, "St. Vincent Assistance Center, all are welcome." The contrast with the luxurious environment where he had dined the night before was stark. Emily jumped out of the car, her blonde curls bouncing with excitement. "Is Grace in there, Daddy?" "We hope so, Princess." The inside of the shelter was clean but basic. Beige-painted walls, plastic chairs, the smell of disinfectant mixed with simple food. Several people occupied the seats, some sleeping, others talking quietly, all with that tired look of someone facing daily hardships. A middle-aged woman with grey hair tied in a bun approached them at the reception desk. "Can I help you?" "We're looking for Grace Williams. She might be staying here." The woman studied them for a moment, clearly surprised by the well-dressed visitors. "Grace? Yes, she arrived last night. She's in the back patio, helping with the community garden." The woman smiled. She said she wanted to keep busy. Richard and Emily were directed through a simple hallway to a door that opened onto a small patio. There was Grace, kneeling beside a vegetable patch, her hands dirty with soil as she transplanted lettuce seedlings. She was wearing the same clothes as the night before, but she had managed to wash up. Her blonde hair was clean and tied back in a simple ponytail. When she looked up and saw Richard and Emily, her expression went through several emotions: surprise, joy, and then an evident concern. "Richard? Emily?" She stood up quickly, wiping her hands on a cloth. "What are you doing here?" Emily ran towards her. "Grace!" "I told Daddy we had to find you." Grace knelt to be at Emily's level, but there was caution in her eyes as she looked at Richard. "I didn't expect to see you again," she said honestly. "Emily wouldn't stop asking about you," Richard explained. "And well, I was also thinking about our conversation last night." Grace nodded slowly, but Richard could see she was bracing herself for some kind of disappointment or formal farewell. "It was a wonderful night," she said carefully. "You gave me much more than you can imagine. But I understand you have your own lives." "Actually," Richard interrupted her, "I came here to make you a proposal." Grace blinked, confused. "A proposal?" Richard looked around the patio, noticing that a few other people were starting to watch the conversation curiously. He lowered his voice. "So you mentioned yesterday that you had administrative experience, that you had worked in an office." "Yes, for almost 6 years." "And you said you can't get a job because you're living on the streets." Grace looked down, clearly embarrassed. "It's a cycle. No fixed address, no proper appearance, no one gives me a chance. And without a job, I can't get off the streets." Emily held Grace's dirt-covered hand. "That's not fair." "No, it's not," Richard agreed. "That's why I'm here." Grace looked at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "I have a chain of hotels," Richard continued, his voice gaining conviction with each word. 23 properties. We always need dedicated, hard-working people." Grace remained silent, as if not daring to believe what she was hearing. "I want to offer you a job as a housekeeper, with full registration and dignity. It's your chance to start over." The words hung in the air for a moment. Grace looked from Richard to Emily, then back to Richard, as if trying to determine if this was real. Are you serious?" "Completely serious. Honest work, a fair salary, all the legal benefits. I'll arrange temporary accommodation at one of our hotels until you get on your feet." Grace covered her face with her hands, and Richard could see her shoulders shaking. When she finally looked up, tears were streaming freely down her cheeks. I don't know what to say. Why? Why are you doing this for me?" Emily squeezed Grace's hand tighter. "Because you're our friend, and friends help each other." The simplicity of the answer made Grace cry even more. She looked at Richard, searching for any sign that this was a cruel joke or a prank. "I'm not looking for a handout," she said through her tears. "If you give me this chance, I will work harder than anyone you've ever hired. I will prove I deserve this opportunity." "I know you will," Richard replied. "I saw that in you last night. You haven't lost your dignity, Grace. You just lost your luck. And luck can change." Grace knelt again and hugged Emily tightly. "Thank you, little princess. You and your father are angels." Emily returned the hug enthusiastically. "Now you won't be hungry anymore." The child's words echoed through the small patio, filled with a simple but profound promise. Grace looked over Emily's shoulder at Richard, and he saw something new in her light blue eyes, not just gratitude, but real hope. "When can I start?" Grace asked, letting go of Emily but keeping her small hands in hers. Tomorrow, if you like. First, we'll get you settled, proper clothes, documents, a decent place to sleep. Then you'll meet the team and start training." Grace shook her head, still trying to process the sudden change in her circumstances. "Yesterday I was begging for food on the street. Today you're offering me a new life. How is this possible?" Richard looked at Emily, who was still holding Grace's hands and smiling radiantly. "Sometimes good things happen when we least expect them," he said. And sometimes we need a child to remind us of what truly matters." In that simple patio, surrounded by vegetable patches and under the afternoon sun, 3 lives intertwined in a way none of them could have predicted. Richard had offered a job, but all 3 of them knew it was much more than a business transaction. It was the beginning of something that would change them all forever. 3 days after the meeting at the shelter, Richard was in his office at the chain's main hotel, reviewing the documents Grace had brought to complete her hiring process. The Human Resources Department had prepared all the necessary paperwork, and Grace was officially ready to start work the following Monday. Richard flipped through the documents with satisfaction, happy to see how everything was falling perfectly into place. Grace had shown herself to be punctual, polite, and clearly eager to start her new life. For the past few days, she had been staying in one of the hotel's staff rooms, taking regular hot showers and eating nutritious meals. The transformation was already visible. Her blonde hair shone, her light blue eyes had regained their liveliness, and she walked with more confidence. He was reviewing Grace's birth certificate when something caught his eye. His gaze fixed on a specific line in the document, and his heart almost stopped. Mother's name, Margaret Rose Williams. Richard dropped the paper on his desk, his hands trembling slightly. He picked up the document again, reading and rereading the name several times to make sure he wasn't seeing things. Margaret Rose Williams. It couldn't be a coincidence. That name was indelibly etched in his memory, associated with some of the most precious memories of his childhood. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, his mind traveling back in time. Margaret Williams had been much more than a nanny in his home. She had been a second mother, a constant and loving presence during his early years. His parents, Thomas and Helena Turner, were busy people. His father was building his corporate law career, frequently traveling for important meetings. His mother was involved in a multitude of social commitments, charity dinners, and high society events. They loved Richard in their own way, but rarely had time for the daily needs of a young child. It was Margaret who woke him up every morning with a warm smile. It was she who prepared his favorite breakfast, pancakes shaped like animals with maple syrup. It was Margaret who checked if he had brushed his teeth, who read him stories before bed, who comforted him when he had nightmares. Richard vividly remembered Margaret's blonde hair, always tied in an impeccable bun, and her light blue eyes that radiated kindness. She had a contagious laugh and always found creative ways to make even the most mundane tasks fun. Margaret had worked for the Turner family for nearly 10 years, from when Richard was 3 until he was 12. She wasn't just an employee, she was part of the family, treated with genuine respect and affection by everyone. Richard remembered how Margaret had taught him to tie his shoes, how she had helped him with his homework, how she had taken him to feed the ducks at the park on weekends. She had been present for every important milestone of his childhood, his first day of school, when he lost his first tooth, when he learned to ride a bike. But perhaps the strongest memory Richard had of Margaret was how she had comforted him when he was 8 and had accidentally broken one of his mother's expensive vases. He was terrified of his parents' reaction, but Margaret had hugged him and said, "Accidents happen, dear. What matters is that you're okay. Things can be replaced, but people can't." When Richard turned 12, Margaret announced that she was moving to another state to care for her own mother, who was getting older and needed help. The farewell had been devastating for the boy. He cried for days, feeling as if he were losing an essential part of his life. Margaret promised to keep in touch, and for a few years they exchanged letters, but gradually, as Richard entered adolescence and became more involved with school, sports, and friends, the correspondence dwindled. By the time he was in college, he had lost contact with her completely. Over the years, Richard often thought of Margaret, especially at important moments in his life. When he graduated from college, when he opened his first hotel, when Emily was born, in all those moments, he wished he could share his achievements with the woman who had been so important in his upbringing. Now, looking at Grace's birth certificate, Richard felt an overwhelming mix of emotions. If Margaret was truly Grace's mother, it meant that the woman he had found on the street was the daughter of the person who had cared for him most during his childhood. Richard pressed the intercom button. "Sarah, could you ask Grace to come to my office, please? Tell her it's about the documents." "Of course, Mr. Turner. She's just finishing her cleaning procedures training. She should be here in a few minutes." Richard waited nervously, arranging and rearranging the papers on his desk. His mind was buzzing with questions. Could it really be the same Margaret? Grace had mentioned she cared for her mother during a terminal illness. That would fit with what he knew of Margaret's caring nature. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Grace appeared, wearing the simple but clean uniform she had received for her training. Her blonde hair was tied back practically, and she seemed more confident than at any time since Richard had met her. "You wanted to see me about the documents?" she asked, sitting in the chair across from his desk. Richard picked up the birth certificate, his hand still trembling slightly. "Grace, I need to ask you something that might seem strange." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Was your mother named Margaret?" The question came out laden with emotion, and Grace immediately noticed something different in Richard's tone. "Yes," she answered slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly with curiosity. "Yeah, but she passed away a few years ago." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions: joy at discovering the connection, sadness at knowing Margaret had died, and an overwhelming sense that fate had orchestrated this meeting. "Margaret Rose Williams?" he asked, needing to be absolutely sure. "Yes." Grace now looked confused and slightly worried. "Richard, why are you asking about my mother? Did you know her?" Richard stood up and walked to the window, trying to process his emotions before answering. When he turned back to Grace, his eyes were moist. "Grace, your mother took care of me when I was a child. Margaret was my nanny from when I was 3 until I was 12. Grace blinked several times, as if she hadn't quite understood. "What?" "Margaret Williams worked for my family for nearly a decade. She was like a second mother to me, one of the most important people of my childhood." Grace stood up slowly, her hand automatically going to her mouth. "That's not possible." "Yes, it is." Richard returned to his chair, picking up the birth certificate. "Did she have blonde hair like yours, light blue eyes, a contagious laugh?" "Yes," Grace whispered. "Did she used to make pancakes in the shape of animals?" Grace nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "She used to do that for me and my siblings when we were little." "Grace," Richard said softly, "I lost touch with your mother when I went to college. I've always regretted that. Margaret was one of the kindest people I've ever known. She taught me so much about compassion, about treating everyone with dignity." Grace sat down again, her legs feeling weak. "My mother used to talk about the family she worked for when she was young. She always said those were very happy years of her life. She talked about a little boy she adored, whom she watched grow up." "That little boy was me," Richard confirmed. Grace covered her face with her hands, trying to process the impossible revelation. "She always said you would grow up to be a good man, that you had a generous heart even when you were very little." Richard felt a lump in his throat. Margaret had talked about him to Grace. Even after all these years, she remembered him fondly. "How did she die?" Richard asked gently. "Lung cancer. It was quick, at the end. She didn't want us to suffer watching her fade away, so she tried to hide how serious it was until it was too late." Grace wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "I used all my savings trying to pay for experimental treatments. When she died, I was completely broke." Richard nodded, now fully understanding how Grace had ended up in the situation where he had found her. "Was she proud of you?" "Very. She always said I was her greatest achievement." Grace smiled through her tears. "She would have been devastated if she knew I ended up on the street." "No," Richard said firmly. "Knowing Margaret, she would have understood. She would have been proud of how you fought, of how you cared for her until the end." Grace looked at him with a new expression, as if seeing Richard in a completely different light. "So that's why," she murmured. "What?" "That's why you helped us at the restaurant. Why you offered me a job. It wasn't charity, it wasn't just kindness. It was because your mother taught me what it means to care for people," Richard completed. "Margaret showed me that true nobility doesn't come from how much money you have, but from how you treat others." Grace stood up again, walking to the window where Richard had stood moments before. "My mother always said that good people eventually find each other. That the universe has a way of connecting those who need to be together." Richard joined her at the window, both of them looking out at the city below. "Grace, offering you a job isn't enough. Not for the daughter of the woman who meant so much to me." Grace looked at him, confused. "I want to invite you to stay at my house until you're completely back on your feet. Emily and I have plenty of space, and it would be an honor to have you with us." Grace was silent for a long moment, processing the invitation. "Richard, that's too much. You've already done so much." "No," he interrupted. "I haven't done enough yet. Margaret cared for me when I was vulnerable and needed love. Now it's my turn to care for her daughter." Grace turned completely towards him, tears streaming freely down her face. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. It will honor her memory to help you, Grace." The words came out like a solemn promise, a vow Richard was making not just to Grace, but to the memory of the woman who had shaped so much of who he had become. Grace couldn't speak for a few minutes, just cried silently while Richard patiently waited for her response. "My mother always said that good deeds come back to us in unexpected ways," she finally managed to say. "I think she was right." "So you accept?" Grace nodded, unable to form words. Richard smiled, the first genuinely happy smile he had given in days. "Let's go pick up Emily from school and tell her the news. I'm sure she'll be thrilled." An hour later, they were in the car on the way to Emily's school. Grace had changed into casual clothes Richard had bought for her, and she looked like a completely different person from the desperate woman who had entered the restaurant just a week before. "To Richard," Grace said as they waited for Emily to come out of school, "can I ask you a question?" "Of course." "If you had known who I was from the beginning, would you have made the same choices?" Richard thought carefully about the question. "Honestly, I don't know. Maybe the revelation would have motivated me to act faster, but the initial decision to help, that came from Emily, and from something Margaret planted in me a long time ago." Emily appeared at the school exit, her blonde hair shining in the sun. When she saw Grace in the car, her face lit up like a Christmas tree. "Grace, you're here!" Richard got out of the car to explain the situation, but Emily had already run to hug Grace. "Princess," Richard said, "I have incredible news. Grace is going to live with us for a while." Emily looked from her father to Grace, then back to her father, as if she couldn't believe her luck. "Really?" "Really," Grace confirmed, beaming. Emily let out a shout of joy that made other parents and children look in their direction. She hugged Grace so tightly she almost knocked her over. "Now we're going to be a real family," Emily exclaimed. The child's innocent words struck both Richard and Grace with unexpected force. They looked at each other over Emily's blonde head, and Richard saw in her light blue eyes the same recognition he felt. This was no longer just about helping someone in need. It was no longer just about honoring Margaret's memory. Something bigger was happening, something none of them had planned, but that they all seemed to need. As they drove home, to their home now, Grace looked out the window and whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. Somewhere, she was sure, Margaret was smiling. The circle had closed in a way none of them could have imagined, and their lives would never be the same. The mornings in the Turner mansion took on a completely new routine in the following weeks. The sound of Emily's laughter echoed through the hallways, mixed with Grace's soft voice telling stories as they prepared breakfast together. Richard came downstairs on a typical Tuesday and found the two of them in the kitchen, Emily sitting on the counter while Grace made pancakes in the shape of animals, just as her mother Margaret had done for him decades before. "Look, Daddy!" Emily pointed to the plate. "Grace made an elephant." Grace smiled, her light blue eyes shining with a joy Richard hadn't seen since he met her. "My mother taught me this trick. She used to say that food made with love always tastes better. While Emily ate, Grace told a story about a brave elephant who helped other animals in the forest. Her voice was expressive, full of different intonations for each character. Richard noticed how completely absorbed Emily was. And then, Grace continued, gesturing dramatically, the elephant used its trunk to reach the kitten stuck in the tree. Because that's what friends do, they help each other, no matter how hard it is. Like you and Daddy, Emily exclaimed. Grace paused, touched by the connection Emily had made. Exactly, sweetie. Richard watched, fascinated by the naturalness with which Emily had adapted to Grace's presence. It was as if a missing piece in their lives had finally clicked into place. After breakfast, Grace helped Emily organize her school backpack. She checked that all the books were in place, that her lunch was properly packed, that Emily had brushed her teeth. "Did you do your homework?" Grace asked affectionately. "I did. Want to see?" Emily ran to get her notebook, eager to show her work. Grace examined each page with genuine attention, praising the neatness of her handwriting. In the afternoon, when Richard returned from work, he often found Emily and Grace in the garden. Grace had discovered that Emily loved flowers and began teaching her about gardening. They had planted a small flower bed of their own, full of colorful flowers. "Flowers need love to grow," Grace explained, as Emily carefully watered the seedlings. "Just like people. And if I give them lots of love, will they grow super big? They'll grow strong and beautiful, that's for sure." Richard watched from his study window, noticing how Grace had changed since she arrived. In the first few days, she still carried a shyness, a hesitation. Now, seeing her interact with Emily, Grace seemed to have found her purpose again. During dinner, Emily always insisted that Grace tell more stories. Grace created narratives about brave girls who solved problems, about families that formed in unexpected ways, about the importance of being kind to strangers. "Once upon a time, there was a girl named Lily," Grace began one evening, "who found a sad lady on the street. Everyone passed by without stopping, but Lily stopped and asked if she could help. Emily listened with total attention. Richard realized that Grace was subtly teaching values through these stories: kindness, empathy, the importance of seeing beyond appearances." "And what happened to the sad lady?" Emily asked. "Lily took her home, where her family welcomed her with kindness, and the lady became part of the family forever." Emily smiled, satisfied. "Like you, Grace?" Grace blinked several times, clearly moved. "Like me, sweetie." On weekends, Grace and Emily developed their own traditions. Saturday mornings were for baking. Grace taught Emily how to make simple cookies and cakes. The kitchen would get messy, full of flour and sugar, but filled with laughter. "Baking is a way of showing love," Grace explained, as Emily mixed the dough. "So when you make food for someone, you're saying, 'I care about you.' Is that why you always make yummy food for us?" "Exactly." Sundays were for calmer activities. Grace read to Emily every afternoon. They would settle into the large armchair in the living room. Emily nestled in Grace's lap, while Grace read with different voices for each character. Richard often found them like this when he returned from his Sunday walks. Grace reading with passion, Emily completely absorbed, both lost in the world of the story. One evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Richard found Grace on the porch, looking at the stars. She seemed thoughtful. "Everything okay?" he asked, sitting down beside her. Grace smiled, but he noticed tears in her eyes. "I'm okay. Better than I've been in years." "Then why are you crying?" "Tears of gratitude. A few weeks ago, I had nothing. No hope, no purpose. And now," she gestured towards the lit-up house, "now I have a family that accepts me, and a little girl who reminds me why it's worth continuing to fight." Richard nodded, understanding completely. "Emily has changed since you arrived, too. She's more complete, happier. She's special. She has the purest heart I've ever seen. You're teaching her important things. About kindness, about caring for others." Grace looked at him with surprise. "Me?" "Richard, it was Emily who taught me about kindness. It was her who insisted on helping me that first night. But now you're shaping how she sees the world. You're teaching her that caring for others is important." Grace was quiet for a moment. "Your mother did that for you, didn't she?" "Margaret." "She did, and now you're doing it for Emily." Grace smiled, and this time there was no sadness in her eyes, only genuine joy. "You know what impresses me the most," Richard continued, "how you've regained your joy. When I met you, you were broken. Now seeing you with Emily, I see someone who has found her purpose again. Emily gave me a reason to smile again, to have hope. There are days when I wake up and forget all the bad months I went through. She sees you as family, you know," he said softly. "I see her that way too." The words hung in the night air, filled with meaning. Richard realized that something fundamental had changed in his home over the last few weeks. Grace had become an integral part of their lives, especially Emily's. "Grace," Richard said finally, "I want you to know that this is your home for as long as you want." Grace turned to him, her light blue eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Thank you. Not just for the house, but for letting me be part of your family. For giving me the chance to love Emily as she deserves to be loved." That night, as Richard went up to his room, he paused at Emily's bedroom door. Grace was there, adjusting the blanket around the sleeping girl, whispering a lullaby that Margaret used to sing to him. It was a full circle, he realized. The love and care Margaret had given him were being passed on to Emily through Grace, and in the process, Grace was healing not only Emily's wounds from the absence of a mother, but also her own wounds caused by loss and despair. The alarm clock went off at 5:30 in the morning, as it had every day for the past 3 weeks. Grace got up quickly, without needing to hit the snooze button. Since she started working at the Turner Grand Hotel, she had never been late a single day. She took a quick shower, put on her impeccably clean uniform, and went down to the kitchen. Richard was already there, drinking coffee and reviewing some reports. "Good morning," she said softly, so as not to wake Emily. "Good morning, Grace. How are you feeling?" "Good. Excited for another day." Richard watched as Grace efficiently prepared her breakfast. Even in the small things, she demonstrated a natural organization that he admired. Everything had its place. Every movement had a purpose. At the hotel, Grace had stood out from day one. She had started as a housekeeper, but her dedication and attention to detail quickly caught everyone's attention. Margaret Silver, the housekeeping supervisor, had commented to Richard the week before, "I've never seen someone so careful with the rooms. Grace doesn't just clean, she takes care of every detail as if it were her own home." Richard decided to observe Grace at work himself. He arrived at the hotel early that morning and discreetly followed her routine. Grace arrived promptly at 7, greeted all her colleagues with a genuine smile, and got her list of rooms. Richard followed her from a distance as she went up to the 12th floor. In the first room, Grace didn't just make the bed and clean the bathroom. She noticed that one of the curtains was slightly crooked and adjusted it. She realized the towels weren't folded in the hotel's standard pattern and redid them. When she saw that the TV remote's batteries were low, she noted it on her personal list to report to maintenance. Richard watched Grace work in 3 more rooms. In each one, she demonstrated the same level of excellence. It wasn't just efficiency, it was genuine pride in her work. In room 1247, Grace found a forgotten bracelet under the bed. She immediately took it to the front desk so it could be returned to the guest. "I found this in the room I just cleaned," she told Clara, the receptionist. "The lady staying there left this morning. Wow, what luck. She called 10 minutes ago asking about the bracelet, said it had sentimental value." Richard observed the genuine satisfaction on Grace's face. She hadn't found the bracelet by chance. She had cleaned under the bed, something many employees overlooked. During lunch, Richard spoke with other supervisors about Grace. "She has an impressive ability to observe," said Carlos, the maintenance manager. "She always reports small problems before they become big ones. Light bulbs that are starting to fail, faucets that are dripping slightly. That saves us a lot of money on repairs. And I've never had to correct any of her work," added Margaret. "It's like she has years of experience, but we know she's just starting." Richard nodded, absorbing the comments. It was clear that Grace didn't see her job as just a job. She saw it as an opportunity to prove her worth. Late in the afternoon, Richard asked Grace to come to his office. "Please, have a seat," he said when she arrived, still wearing her uniform. Grace sat down, her hands folded in her lap. There was a slight concern in her eyes, as if she were trying to figure out if she had made a mistake. "Grace, I've called you here to talk about your performance." "Yes, sir," she replied formally. "In the past 3 weeks, I've received nothing but praise for your work, from supervisors, from other employees, even from guests." Grace blinked, surprised. "Shy from guests? Mr. Morrison, from room 1156, specifically requested that you continue to look after his room for his entire stay. He said he's never seen a room so well kept." A small smile appeared on Grace's face. "I just do my job." "No, Grace, you do much more than that." Richard stood up and walked to the window. "But you work with excellence and with pride, with a dedication that goes beyond what is expected." Grace remained silent, but Richard could see that his words were moving her. "I spoke with Margaret Silver today. She told me that you often stay late to help colleagues who are behind, that you offer suggestions to improve procedures, that you treat every room as if you were hosting your own family. I just want to do a good job," Grace said softly. "And you are. But here's the thing, Grace." Richard turned to her. "You have the potential for so much more." Grace looked at him with a confused expression. "What do you mean?" Richard returned to his chair, choosing his words carefully. "Grace, you deserve more than this. I want to offer you a better position with more responsibilities." The words hung in the air for a moment. Grace opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "A better position?" she finally managed to ask. "Assistant manager. You would work directly with me and the other managers, overseeing operations, training new employees, helping to implement improvements in procedures." Grace gripped the sides of the chair, as if needing to anchor herself. "Richard, I've barely finished 3 weeks as a housekeeper. And in these 3 weeks, you've shown more leadership and vision than some managers who have been working here for years." Grace shook her head slowly. "Are you sure? I don't want you to think I'm taking advantage of our personal situation." Richard leaned forward, looking directly into Grace's light blue eyes. "Grace, if you were anyone else, any other employee, I would make the exact same offer. This has nothing to do with our friendship or with Margaret. This has to do with merit." Grace was silent for a few minutes, processing the offer. Richard could see various emotions cross her face: surprise, gratitude, anxiety, and finally, a growing determination. "And what would the salary be?" she asked practically. Richard mentioned a figure that was almost 3 times what she earned as a housekeeper. Grace covered her mouth with her hand. "It's a fair salary for the position," Richard explained. "You'll have to work hard, make difficult decisions, deal with complex problems. But I believe you're ready for it." Grace stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. Richard could see her reflection in the glass, tears silently streaming down her cheeks. "A few months ago," she said finally, without turning around, "I was sleeping on park benches, eating leftover food when I could find it. Now you're offering me a management position. Now you are rebuilding your life," Richard corrected, "with dignity, with your own merit." Grace turned around, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "I accept," she said firmly. "I accept, and I promise you will never regret this decision." Richard smiled. "I know I won't." Grace walked back to the chair but didn't sit down. There was a new energy in her posture, a confidence Richard hadn't seen before. "When can I start?" "On Monday. That gives you the weekend to prepare mentally." "And Emily? How will I explain it to her? Tell her the truth?" "That you worked hard and got promoted because you deserved it?" Grace nodded, drying her tears. "Richard, I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to thank me. Just keep being who you are, dedicated, honest, caring, and remember that this promotion is just the beginning." When Grace left the office, Richard watched her walk down the hall. There was something different in her stride, not just confidence, but purpose. Grace wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. That night, during dinner, Grace told Emily about her promotion. "Does that mean you're going to be a boss?" Emily asked, impressed. "It means I'm going to help take care of your daddy's hotel." "How cool. Now you're important." Grace held Emily's small hand. "I was always important, sweetie. Sometimes we just need a chance to show it." Richard watched the interaction, feeling a deep satisfaction. Grace was not only rebuilding her professional life, she was rebuilding her self-esteem, her dignity, her vision for the future. The woman he had found desperate at the restaurant door was finally discovering who she really was, a competent professional, a valuable person, someone who deserved every opportunity life could offer. 6 months had passed since Grace arrived at the Turner mansion. Autumn was arriving with its golden leaves covering the garden she and Emily had tended together all summer. The flowers they planted were blooming in vibrant colors, a tangible symbol of how their lives had also blossomed. Grace was on the porch, watching Emily play in the garden with Whiskers, the cat. The girl ran among the trees, her blonde hair flying in the wind, while Grace watched her with the maternal smile that had become natural over the past few months. Richard arrived home from work that Friday afternoon to a familiar and comforting scene. Grace and Emily were preparing dinner together, as they always did. The kitchen was filled with laughter and the aroma of something delicious in the oven. "Daddy!" Emily ran to hug him. "Grace is teaching me how to make lasagna." "That's great, Princess." Richard looked at Grace, noticing something different in her expression. There was a serenity there, but also a subtle melancholy he had learned to recognize. During dinner, Grace was quieter than usual. She answered Emily's questions with her usual affection, but Richard felt she was processing something important in her mind. After Emily went to bed, Grace asked to speak with Richard in the living room. She sat in the armchair where she used to read to Emily, her hands folded in her lap. "Richard," she began softly, "I need to talk to you about something important." Richard sat on the sofa, already suspecting what was coming. "I'm listening." Grace took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage. "I'm ready to stand on my own 2 feet." The words hung in the air between them. Richard had been expecting this moment, but that didn't make it any less difficult to hear. "Are you sure?" "I am," Grace nodded firmly. "Over the last few months, you've given me everything I needed to get back on my feet. A roof, food, work, dignity, but more importantly than that, you gave me a family." Richard saw tears forming in Grace's light blue eyes. "And that's exactly why I know it's time to go. Emily is getting too attached to me, and I'm getting too attached to you all as well." "Grace, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not bad, but it's not fair." Grace stood up and walked to the window. "Emily needs to learn she can be happy without depending on me. And I need to prove to myself that I can live independently." Richard understood the logic, but it didn't make the situation any less painful. "Where will you live?" "I found a small apartment a few blocks from the hotel. It's simple, but it's mine. With my new salary, I can pay the rent and still save a little. And Emily? How are we going to tell her?" Grace returned to the armchair, her hands trembling slightly. "Tomorrow morning. I want her to understand that this isn't abandonment, it's a graduation." The next morning, Grace prepared a special breakfast, pancakes in the shape of hearts. Emily was excited, unsuspecting of the conversation to come. "Emily," Grace said softly, sitting beside the girl, "I need to talk to you about something important." Emily stopped eating, her light blue eyes fixing on Grace's face. "You know how I came to be here, don't you? I was lost, without a home, without a family." Emily nodded. "And you and your daddy took me in, gave me a safe place to stay, helped me find a job." "Yes," Emily said, still not understanding where the conversation was heading. "Well, now I'm strong again. I have a good job, I've saved money, and I'm ready to have my own home." Emily frowned. "But you already have a home, here." Grace felt her heart ache. "Emily, sweetie, this will always be my second home. But now I need to have my own space, my own life." Understanding began to dawn on Emily's face. "You're leaving." "I'm not leaving forever. I'm moving to an apartment nearby. We'll see each other all the time." Emily was silent for a moment, processing the information, then her eyes filled with tears. No. You can't leave. Emily! No! Emily stood up from her chair, tears running down her cheeks. You promised we would be a family. Grace knelt in front of Emily, her own tears beginning to fall. Sweetie, we will always be family. Families don't have to live in the same house to love each other. But I don't want you to go, Emily sobbed. Please stay. Grace stroked the girl's face, her fingers gently wiping away the tears. Emily, look at me. Emily reluctantly looked into Grace's eyes. After my mother passed away, everything fell apart. I forgot what it was like to have a family. I ended up on the streets alone, but with you I felt welcomed again. And I will never forget that. Emily continued to cry, but she was listening. You saved me in a way that goes far beyond giving me food and shelter. You reminded me of who I really am. You gave me the strength to rebuild my life. Then why do you have to leave? Grace smiled through her own tears. Because now I'm strong enough to... And you're strong enough to let me go. Emily threw herself into Grace's arms, hugging her with all the strength her little arms could muster. I'm going to miss you every day. Me too, little princess. Me too. Richard watched the scene from the kitchen doorway, feeling his own heart break. He understood Grace's decision, but that didn't make it any less painful to see his daughter suffering. The rest of the day passed in a haze of mixed emotions. Grace packed her few belongings, clothes Richard had bought for her, a few books Emily had insisted she take, and photos they had taken together during their months living together. Emily followed Grace around the house like a lost puppy, trying to memorize every moment. Will you come for dinner tomorrow? Emily asked. If you invite me. And next weekend. If you want me to. And will you still tell me stories? Grace knelt again to Emily's height. For whenever you want to hear one. In the late afternoon, the taxi arrived to take Grace to her new apartment. Richard carried her single suitcase to the car, while Emily refused to leave Grace's side. This isn't goodbye, Grace said, hugging Emily one last time. It's a see you later. Emily couldn't answer, just cried silently in the embrace. Grace turned to Richard. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. Richard hugged her, feeling the weight of gratitude and loss at the same time. Take care of yourself, Grace, and remember, this will always be your home. Grace got into the taxi and waved from the window as the car pulled away. Emily and Richard stood at the entrance, watching until the car disappeared around the corner. That night was the hardest since Grace had arrived. Emily barely touched her dinner, even though Richard had ordered pizza, her favorite food. She's coming back, right, Daddy? Emily asked for the 5th time. She will, Princess. Grace will always be a part of our lives. But Emily wasn't convinced. She played unenthusiastically with her toys, without her usual animation. At bedtime, she asked Richard to read to her, since Grace was no longer there to do it. Richard chose one of Emily's favorite books, but his voice lacked the expressive magic that Grace brought to the stories. Emily lay quiet, clearly missing the animated voices and gestures Grace made. Daddy, Emily said softly when Richard finished reading. Yes, Princess. Why did Grace have to leave? Richard sat on the edge of the bed, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes, when people get strong again, they need to prove to themselves that they can take care of themselves. Emily was quiet for a moment, but we took good care of her. Yes, we did. Very good care. So why wasn't it enough? Richard sighed, struggling to explain adult concepts to a 5-year-old. Love sometimes means letting people be independent, even when we want to keep them with us forever. Emily began to cry again, silently but steadily. Come here, Princess. Emily moved into Richard's lap, snuggling into his arms like when she was smaller. She will always be your friend. Now either she comes to visit us or we visit her. Emily cried for a few minutes, then suddenly looked up at Richard with red, swollen eyes. Daddy, I miss having a mum, and when Grace was here, it felt like I had one. The words hit Richard like a lightning bolt. He had suspected Emily's feelings, but hearing her direct words was devastating. Richard felt his own eyes fill with tears as he held his daughter closer. Emily, Grace took care of me like I imagine a mother would. She told me stories, taught me things, worried about me when I was sad. Richard struggled to find the right words. The death of Emily's mother had been so traumatic that she rarely talked about missing having a mother. Hearing it now, in connection with Grace's departure, made everything clear. Grace hadn't been just a guest or even a friend. For Emily, she had filled a maternal void that Richard hadn't realized was so deep. "Sweetie," Richard said softly, "you're right. Grace took care of you like a mother would." Emily looked up, surprised that he acknowledged her feelings. "And it's okay to miss that. It's natural. But now she's gone. She's moved to her own house, but the love she has for you hasn't gone away." Emily considered this for a moment. "Daddy, do you think I'll see her tomorrow?" "I don't know, Princess. But I know that when you see her again, she'll still love you just the same." Emily snuggled back against Richard's chest. "I wish she was my real mum." The confession broke Richard's heart completely. He hugged Emily tightly, realizing that Grace's departure had exposed a deep wound he didn't know existed. "Emily, Grace will always be special to us. And who knows what the future holds." "What do you mean?" Richard wasn't sure what he meant. The words had come out instinctively, but now he wondered if there was something deeper behind them. "I mean that sometimes the best things in life happen when we least expect them." Emily finally fell asleep in his arms. Richard carried her to her bed and covered her, watching her peaceful face and wondering how he had missed how attached she had become to Grace. How had Grace become so essential to Emily's happiness? And more importantly, what did that mean for all of them going forward? Richard left Emily's room with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. Grace's departure had left a void that would be very difficult to fill. The house felt empty without her laughter, without her stories, without her gentle presence that had become so natural to their daily routine. For the first time since Grace had arrived, Richard wondered if letting her go had been the right decision, or if they had lost something precious that they would never be able to replace. 2 weeks after Grace's move, the phone rang at the Turner mansion on a Saturday afternoon. Emily ran to answer, eagerly waiting for any news from her dear friend. "Hello? Hi, Princess." "It's Grace." Emily's face lit up instantly. "Grace, Grace, Daddy, it's Grace." Richard approached, smiling at the genuine joy on his daughter's face. "Hi, sweetie," Grace said from the other end of the line. "I have a special invitation for you." "What kind of invitation?" Emily asked, jumping with excitement. "How about you come for dinner at my place tomorrow?" "I want to show you my apartment and cook a special meal," Emily shouted with joy, and Richard took the phone. "Of course, Grace. What time?" 6 o'clock. It's nothing fancy, but it will be made with lots of love. We'll be there." The following Sunday, Richard and Emily walked through the streets to the neighborhood where Grace had moved. It was a simpler area of the city, with modest but well-kept apartment buildings. They climbed the stairs and knocked on the door of apartment 2B. Grace opened it immediately, as if she had been waiting on the other side. "You're here," she exclaimed, hugging Emily first, then Richard. Grace led them into the small apartment. It was a compact space, a living room that connected to an open kitchen, 1 bedroom and a bathroom. But every corner was tidy and carefully arranged, decorated with simplicity and good taste. "Wow!" Emily ran through the room, examining everything. "It's so pretty, Grace." On the walls, Grace had hung some of the photos they had taken together during their months at the mansion. A small table was set for 3, with a blue and white checkered tablecloth and fresh flowers in the center. "It's small," Grace said, a bit shyly, "but it's mine." "It's perfect," Richard said sincerely. "You've made it a home." A delicious aroma came from the kitchen. Grace had prepared a feast considering the size of the space: roast chicken with herbs, mashed potatoes, sautéed vegetables, and for dessert, Emily's favorite chocolate cake. "Grace, did you cook all this?" Richard asked, impressed. "I started early this morning. I wanted everything to be perfect." Grace served drinks, orange juice for Emily and wine for Richard. They sat at the small table, which was a little tight, but cozy. "Before we begin," Grace said, raising her glass, "I'd like to make a toast." Emily raised her juice glass, imitating the adults. "For months, You took care of me in every possible way. You gave me food, shelter, work, dignity, but more importantly, you gave me love. Richard saw tears forming in Grace's eyes. Tonight, it's my turn to take care of you. They gently clinked their glasses. Emily laughed at the sound of the crystal. The dinner was magical. Grace had prepared every dish exactly as Richard and Emily liked it. The chicken was seasoned the way Emily loved, with a touch of garlic and herbs. The mashed potatoes were creamy and well seasoned. Remember the first time we ate together? Emily asked between bites. At the fancy restaurant, Grace replied. I was so nervous I could barely hold my fork. And I shared my potatoes with you, Emily added proudly. That's when I knew you were special, Grace said, stroking Emily's blonde hair. Richard watched the interaction, feeling a familiar warmth. Even in a small apartment, far from the mansion, the connection between Grace and Emily remained intact. Grace, Richard said, how is work, as an assistant manager? Grace's eyes lit up. It's challenging, but I'm loving it. Yesterday, I implemented a new system for housekeeping that will save almost an hour per room. Richard nodded, impressed. Grace was clearly finding her professional footing. And the other managers, how are they treating you? At first, some were skeptical. After all, I had been a housekeeper just a few months ago. But when they saw the results, they changed their minds. Emily listened to the conversation, even if she didn't fully understand the work details. You're very smart, Grace, she said simply. Grace smiled, touched by the child's innocent confidence. During dessert, Grace brought out photo albums she had started to assemble. Look what I did. The pages were filled with photos from the months they had spent together. Grace in the garden with Emily, the three of them at the park, Emily teaching Grace how to ride a bike, Richard and Grace preparing Emily's birthday dinner. I didn't know you had taken so many pictures, Richard said. I wanted to preserve every moment. You gave me memories I want to cherish forever. Emily turned the pages slowly, stopping at a photo where she was hugging Grace in the kitchen, both covered in flour after making cookies. This one is my favorite, Emily said. Mine too, Grace replied. After dinner, Grace showed them the rest of the apartment. The bedroom was simple but cozy, with a twin bed, a small dresser, and a reading chair near the window. This is where I read before bed, Grace explained. Remember the books we used to read together? Emily nodded. I still read to you, even from far away. Every night before I sleep, I pick a book and imagine I'm telling you the story. Emily ran to hug Grace. Me too. I take the books you gave me and pretend you're reading to me. Richard felt a pang in his chest seeing the deep connection between the two. They spent the evening talking, reminiscing, laughing. Grace told stories about her work, her funny colleagues, the interesting guests she met. Richard shared news about the hotel chain's expansion, and Emily talked about school and her new drawings. You know, Grace said as they washed the dishes together, this little apartment feels like a palace to me. Why? Emily asked. Because it's mine. I earned it with my own work. And because I know you will always be welcome here. When it was time to leave, no one wanted the evening to end. Can we do this every week? Emily asked hopefully. Maybe not every week, Grace laughed, but definitely often. The following months established a new routine. Grace visited the mansion at least twice a week, always bringing stories from work or small gifts for Emily. They had dinner together at Grace's apartment at least once a month, and Grace never missed an important event in Emily's life. At the hotel, Grace continued to excel. Richard began to consult her on important decisions, recognizing that she had a unique and valuable perspective. She implemented several improvements that increased efficiency and guest satisfaction. Grace has a natural instinct for hospitality, Richard told his management team. She understands that taking care of people is the essence of our business. For Emily, Grace remained a constant maternal figure. She still called Grace when she had problems at school, still asked for advice about friendships, still wanted Grace to be present for every important moment. Grace is like my heart mum, Emily explained to a school friend. The friend asked, but you don't live together. You don't have to live together to be family, Emily replied, with the wisdom of a child who had learned that love has no boundaries. On an autumn Saturday, Almost a year after Grace had moved out, the three of them decided to have a picnic in the park where they had spent so many afternoons together. Grace brought sandwiches, Richard brought drinks, and Emily insisted on bringing cookies she had baked herself. "They're a little burnt," she admitted, "but I made them with lots of love." They found their favorite spot under a large oak tree, spread out a blanket, and settled in for a relaxing afternoon. Emily ran off to play on the playground while Richard and Grace watched from the blanket. "Look at her," Grace said softly. "So confident, so happy." "You had a lot to do with that," Richard replied. "We all did. That's what families do." Richard looked at Grace, studying her profile as she watched Emily. "Grace, do you ever regret it?" "The decision to move out?" Grace considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "It was the right thing to do. Emily needed to learn that she could be happy without depending on me, and I needed to prove to myself that I could be independent. And now we have something even better. We have a choice. I choose to be in your lives, and you choose to have me in yours. It's stronger because it's voluntary." Emily ran back to them, breathless and covered in leaves. "Look what I found." She held up a small acorn. "We can plant a tree." "Where?" Grace asked. "In my garden. That way we'll always have a tree that we planted together." Richard smiled. "That sounds like a perfect plan." As the afternoon turned into evening, they packed up their things and started the walk home. Emily skipped between Richard and Grace, holding both of their hands. "Grace," Emily said suddenly, "you know what?" "What, sweetie?" "I used to be sad that you moved out. But now I think it's perfect. Why? Because now when we're together, it's because we want to be together, not because we have to be." Grace stopped walking, impressed by the little girl's wisdom. "Emily, that's exactly right." Richard looked at his daughter with pride. At 6 years old, she had understood something that many adults never learn. They resumed their walk, moving slowly through the tree-lined streets as the sun set behind them. Their shadows stretched long on the sidewalk, 3 figures walking close to one another. "You know," Grace said quietly, "when I was living on the streets, I thought happiness was just having food and shelter. And now," Richard asked, "now I know that happiness is being loved and having people to love back. It's feeling like you matter to someone." Emily squeezed Grace's hand. "You matter to us. And you matter to me. Forever." They continued walking, their laughter echoing through the quiet streets. 3 people who had found each other through the most unlikely circumstances, who had become a family not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the simple decision to care for one another. When they reached the corner where they would part ways, Richard and Emily to the mansion, Grace to her apartment, none of them seemed ready to say goodbye. "Same time next week?" Grace asked. "Definitely," Richard answered. "Promise," Emily added. "Promise," Grace said, sealing it with a hug. They stood there for a moment, enjoying the warmth of their connection. Then Grace started walking toward her apartment, turning to wave until she disappeared around a corner. Richard and Emily watched until she was gone, then started their own walk home. "Daddy," Emily said as they walked. "Yes, Princess." "We're lucky, aren't we? Very lucky." "Because Grace found us." Richard thought about it. "Because we found each other." Emily considered this as they neared home. "So, Daddy, do you think other people are alone like Grace was?" "I'm sure they are." "Then maybe we should help them too." Richard smiled, impressed once again by the big heart in such a small person. "Maybe we should." As they entered the house, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. It had started with a simple question from a 5-year-old girl. "Daddy, can we help her?" That question had changed 3 lives forever. Small gestures of kindness can transform destinies and create bonds that last forever. Sometimes all it takes is a willingness to see beyond appearances, to extend a hand to someone in need, to open your heart when it would be easier to look the other way. In a world that can often seem cold and indifferent, Richard, Emily, and Grace had discovered that love can blossom in the most unexpected places, that families can be formed through compassion, and that sometimes the greatest gifts we receive are the ones we give to others. Their story was proof that no matter how low someone might fall, how broken they might seem, with a little kindness and a lot of love, anyone can find their way back to hope, to dignity, to home. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to